Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Welcome back to episode 3 of Podcasts of the Caribbean. So we're going to be picking up right where we left off last episode. We just arrived at Isla de Muerta. So if you haven't listened to the first 2 episodes of the podcast, make sure you go back and listen to those ones first. If you've seen the movie before, you'll obviously know what I'm talking about and what's going on in the movie. But if you haven't seen it before or you need a refresher, go make sure you listen to those 2 episodes beforehand so you know where we are in the plot of the first movie. So, one quick thing before we really get started here. I want to address news we just got about Pirates of the Caribbean. So we just got news today, Monday, November 14th, which is the day I'm recording this podcast, that the Margot Robbie reboot / spin-off Pirates of the Caribbean movie that was in development is no longer happening. So I am a little sad about it, not super sad. I was very interested to see what it was going to be about. If it was going to be about an original character, if it was going to be about a character from the ride. But it's unfortunately no longer happening. Of course, this was going to be a reboot or a spin-off. It was never really confirmed, but it was obviously going to be more female-led. I would have really been interested to see what it would have been about. Maybe we'll get details about, the plot and everything, maybe, but that's a little bit of Pirates of the Caribbean news for you all. So if there's Pirates of the Caribbean news, I'll make sure to recap it at the start of each episode. But with that said, let's get into The Curse of the Black Pearl. All right, so we start with Elizabeth in the captain's cabin of the Black Pearl, and a few of the pirates come in, and Pintel says, "Time to go, puppet." Last episode, I forgot to mention that Pintel and Ragetti are played by Lee Arenberg and Mackenzie Crook. Sorry about that. I love these characters, and I really wish that they were in more movies. They were only in the first 3. After At World's End, we don't know what happened to them, unfortunately. We don't know if they're alive. We don't know if they're dead. But I love Pintel and Ragetti. They're great. So Elizabeth dons the Aztec medallion once more, and the pirates sail into the caves of Isla de Muerta, which gets this really cool scene of the pirates all on the boats, and then the camera zooms all the way out, so we see the entire island before the camera is enveloped by fog. And then we're brought back to the Interceptor, which is sailing through a foggy ship graveyard. Cotton's parrot then says the words "dead men tell no tales," which is a reference to the theme park ride. And we see all of these sunken ships. We don't know if they were sailing to Isla de Muerta, because they are close to Isla de Muerta. They're right off the island here. So I don't know if they were sailing to Isla de Muerta and sunk, or if it was Barbossa who was defending the island. We don't really know for sure. But we see all these sunken ships, and then Will looks at Jack and he asks Gibbs, how did Jack come by that compass? And then Gibbs begins to tell Will what he knows about Jack Sparrow's past. So Gibbs says not a lot's known about Jack Sparrow before he showed up in Tortuga with a mind after the Black Pearl. And that'd be before I met him, back when he was captain of the Black Pearl. And then Will says, what? And then Gibbs is like, whoops, shouldn't have said that. And then Will's like, he failed to mention that. And Gibbs says he keeps things closer to the vest now. It's a hard-learned lesson it was. So Gibbs tells Will that Jack was the captain of the Black Pearl, and Barbossa was his first mate. And Jack was sailing to find the treasure of the Isla de Muerta, which of course was the Aztec gold. And he gave up the location of the treasure to Barbossa 3 days out into the venture. This was a bad decision for Jack, because later that night, Barbossa and the crew staged a mutiny, and they marooned Jack on an island and gave him a pistol with one shot and left him alone on the island to die. But Jack escaped that island and he still got that single shot. He won't use it save for one man, and that man is Barbossa. And then Will has one more question for Gibbs, and he says, how did Jack escape the island? And Gibbs tells him this great story. Like, well, I'll tell you. He waded out in the water and stayed there for 3 days and 3 nights, till all manner of sea creatures were acclimated to his presence. And then, on the 4th morning, he wrapped himself a couple of sea turtles, rashed them together, and made a raft. And then Will says, he roped himself a couple of sea turtles. And Gibbs says, aye, sea turtles. And Will says, what did he use for rope? And then Jack, who has been standing there for potentially a decent amount of time now, replies and says, human hair from my back. I love this scene. It's a great way to kind of recap Jack's past to Will and also for the audience as well. And it really just gives us the story we need between Jack and Barbossa and why Jack wants to get the pearl back from Barbossa, and he still has that shot in his pistol he hasn't used for 10 whole years. He's saved it to only use on Barbossa once the curse is lifted. So then Jack says that he and Will are going to go ashore. And Gibbs says, Captain, what if the worst should happen? And Jack says to him, keep to the code. And Will hears this, and he's intrigued because he doesn't know what they're talking about. He doesn't know the code. So that is something that Will keeps in mind. He's not fully trusting Jack yet. So then Jack and Will are sailing through the cave of Isla de Muerta in their boat. And Will is looking around, and he sees a pirate impaled by a sword on the shore, which is another reference to the theme park ride. Of course, right to the dead man's grotto section of the ride with all the skeletons on the beach. And one of them is in the exact position as the one in the film here with the sword through his back. And then Will sees this and he asks Jack, what code is Gibbs to keep to if the worst should happen? And Jack tells him, pirate's code. Any man who falls behind is left behind. And then Will says, no heroes amongst thieves, eh? And then Jack has this great little moment where he tells Will, for having such a bleak outlook on pirates, you're well on your way to becoming one. And Will is, what do you mean by that? And then Jack says, sprung a man from jail, sailed with a buccaneer crew out of the Tortuga, and you're completely obsessed with treasure. And then Will says, that's not true. I am not obsessed with treasure. And Jack says, not all treasure is silver and gold, mate. So, of course, he's referring to Elizabeth in this moment. But I love that line by Jack, not all treasure is silver and gold. One of my favorite quotes in this whole franchise. So now they've reached the cave and they see all the pirates around their gold. So the pirates have been hoarding this gold for a decade. They've raided countless towns and ports and collected all of this gold and all this loot. So we see all of them unloading their recent loot that they hauled from Port Royal, of course. And Pintel says, 10 years of hoarding swag, and now we finally get to spend it. And then Pintel and Rigetti dump this trunk that they stole, and it's full of dresses. So I love that little moment there. And then Elizabeth is brought up to the main treasure hill, or whatever it is, treasure pile, treasure hill, the pile of treasure with the chest of the Aztec gold, which we see for the first time here. It is almost filled. They have 881 pieces currently in that chest. The last piece is the one that's currently around Elizabeth's neck. So then Barbossa gets ready to begin the ritual to break the curse, because this is the final piece. Once the blood is on this piece of Aztec gold, the curse will be broken. So Jack and Will are observing this from their little hiding spot away from the cave. And then Will sees Elizabeth and he causes a little noise to be made with some coins slipping, and Jack the monkey hears this. And then Jack says, wait until the opportune moment. And then Will replies and says, when's that? When it's of greatest profit to you? And then Jack says, have I ever given you reason not to trust me? So please, I know it's hard for you, but just stay here and try not to do anything stupid. And then while Jack is trying to make his way to the cave, Will grabs one of the oars from the boats and knocks Jack out cold. And then he says, sorry, Jack, I'm not going to be your leverage. So Will, of course, at this point, he's caught on to Jack's plan to use Will because we have the leverage mentioned once again, which we will have it brought up even more times in this franchise. So make sure to keep leverage in mind. But Will doesn't trust Jack fully, which is why he knocks him out here, because he's beginning to realize what Jack is going to use him for. Barbossa is about ready to begin the blood ritual, and before he cuts Elizabeth's hand, he opens the Aztec chest and shows the pirates all the gold and says, every last piece we've restored, save for this. And he points to Elizabeth. And then the pirates then say, suffered I have. And Barbossa says, punished we were, the lot of us, disproportionate to our crimes. And then Barbossa says, you know what I'm going to do after the curse is lifted? Eat a whole bushel of apples. And he puts the Aztec medallion in Elizabeth's hand. He cuts it and gets the blood on it. And Elizabeth says, that's it? And Barbossa replies, waste not. And then Elizabeth releases the Aztec medallion, and it falls into the chest with the blood on it, which in theory would break the curse. So Barbossa and the crew are believing that the curse is finally broken, but they don't feel any different. And then Pintel's like, how do we tell? And then Barbossa pulls out his pistol and shoots Pintel right in the heart. And then Kohler says, you are not dead. And then Pintel's like, no, he shot me. And then they're like, the curse is still upon us. And then Barbossa realizes, and he asks Elizabeth, you made your father's name. Was your father William Turner? And then Elizabeth says, no. So now we have Barbossa angry because he has the wrong person. This person will not break the curse because it's not Swan's blood he needs, it's Turner's blood. So he slaps Elizabeth, sends her down the treasure hill, and he also lets go of the Aztec medallion, so he loses that. And while Barbossa and his crew are arguing, Will comes out of the water and saves Elizabeth. They also grab the Aztec medallion before they leave, so Barbossa doesn't have it. So the crew and Barbossa are arguing currently, and Kohler says, who's to blame here? Every decision you've made has led us from bad to worse. And then the crew are ready to pretty much stage a mutiny on Barbossa this time. Barbossa pulls out his sword and says, if any man dare challenge me, let him speak. And then he snuffs that little rebellion out. But then Jack the monkey alerts Barbossa that Elizabeth is gone with the medallion. So Barbossa yells at his crew, get after you useless pack of ingrates. And then the pirate crew then chases Elizabeth and Will through the cave, and they stumble upon a familiar face. And this familiar face is Captain Jack Sparrow, who is just woken back up from being knocked out. And the pirates see him and they say, you're supposed to be dead. And then Jack's like, am I not? And then Barbossa comes out and says, how the blazes did you get off that island? And then Jack says, when you marooned me on that godforsaken spit of land, you forgot one very important thing, mate. I'm Captain Jack Sparrow. And then Barbossa says, I'll not be making that mistake again. And then he orders his men to shoot Jack, but Jack says something that gets Barbossa's attention. And he says, the girl's blood didn't work, did it? And then Barbossa says, hold your fire. You know whose blood we need. And then Jack smiles at Barbossa and says, I know whose blood you need. So now Jack is making a deal with Barbossa. So this is all part of Jack's plan. Of course, Jack's plan Jack's plan didn't go how he expected it to, but Jack, being the not predictable and the cunning person that he is, he adapts and he makes a new plan. This one containing Barbossa and a deal made with him. So Will and Elizabeth get back to the Interceptor. Before they left the caves, they took all of the oars for the pirates' boats and scattered them through the ocean, so the pirates will have a harder time getting back to the Black Pearl. But unfortunately for them, the pirates don't really need boats or oars to get through the ocean. And that's something that we'll see later in the film. But Will and Elizabeth get back onto the Interceptor, and Gibbs says, "Welcome aboard, Miss Elizabeth." And then Elizabeth recognizes Josh McGibbs because she's seen him 8 years ago on the Dauntless. Then Gibbs asks Will, "Hey boy, where be Jack?" And then Will says he fell behind. So they keep to the code, and then they begin to depart the island of Isla de Muerta. So then we go below decks on the Interceptor, and we have a nice scene of Elizabeth and Will. This is the first scene that we get of just Will and Elizabeth talking. So it's up there with one of my favorite scenes, because this is a great realization moment for Will Turner here. And he is bandaging her hand because, of course, it was cut. So he's bandaging her hand up, and he asks Elizabeth, "You gave my name instead of yours. Why?" And then she says, "I don't know." And then she winces because he tied the bandage too tight, and he says, "Sorry, blacksmith's hands, I know they're rough." And then Elizabeth says, "Yes, they are, but don't stop." And let me tell you, this scene, man, oh man, this is one of the scenes we'll get to in these films, but oh man, for a person growing up with these films, this scene was definitely something. So they get close and get ready to kiss, but Elizabeth pulls Will's hand down to the Aztec medallion, and she tells him that it was his, and then that she took it from him. And then Will says, it was a gift from his father, and he asks her, why did she take it? And Elizabeth says, "Because I thought you were a pirate. That would have been awful." And then Will realizes this and says, "It wasn't your blood they needed. It was my father's blood. My blood. The blood of a pirate." So Will, in this moment, he's now realizing that his father was a pirate, and Jack was telling him the truth earlier in the film. So Will is angry, and Elizabeth leaves him to brood in silence. And then we go over to the Black Pearl, where we have Jack and Barbossa sharing a scene together. And they are currently making a deal. And Barbossa is not too happy with this deal so far. And then so Barbossa says to him, "You expect to leave me standing on some beach with naught but a name and watching you sail away on my ship?" And Jack says, "No. I expect to leave you standing on some beach with no name at all, watching me sail away on my ship, and then I'll shout the name back to you. Savvy?" Then Barbossa says, "Well, that still leaves the problem of me standing on some beach with naught but a name, and your word, it's the one I need." And then Jack says, "Of the two of us, I am the only one who hasn't committed mutiny, so my word is the word we'll be trusting." And then he gets back at Barbossa and says, "Plus, if you hadn't stranded me on that island and left me to die, I'd be sharing equal part in that curse, same as you. Funny old world, isn't it?" And then Barbossa fake laughs because he knows Jack is right, and he spared Jack the curse by marooning him on that island 10 years ago. So while they're having this chat, Bosun comes into the captain's cabin and says, "We're catching up on the Interceptor." And both of all the pirates in the cabin go out on deck, and they see the Interceptor in front of the ship. So Jack has one last plea to Barbossa here, and he's like, "I'm having a thought here, Barbossa. Why don't we run up a flag of truce? I'll scurry over to the interceptor, and I'll negotiate fair trade for your medallion, eh? What say you to that? And then Barbossa says, now you see, Jack, that's the attitude that lost you the pearl. People are easy to search when they're dead. And then he tells the crew to lock Jack in the brig, and then he grabs the apple from Jack's hand that he was eating and throws it in the ocean. And then we have a great piece of music score here with the track known as Barbossa is Hungry, which of course is what I start the podcast off with. So I haven't mentioned the score for the film yet. I've kind of been saving it for its own episode, probably. But I mean, the score for these films, all 5 films, is absolutely fantastic. The score for this first movie was composed by Klaus Badelt, which, of course, is not Hans Zimmer, but Hans Zimmer did produce this soundtrack. The reason Hans Zimmer did not do Pirates 1 is because when he did the score for The Last Samurai, the movie with Tom Cruise, he was in a contract that wouldn't allow him to do another soundtrack within, I think, like a year or so of the film, I think, something like that. So he couldn't actually compose the score, but he did make the themes, and he did most of the actual music with, especially He's a Pirate, which is the main theme of Pirates of the Caribbean. But his student, or I'm pretty sure it was his student, Klaus Badelt, came in and composed the score. But Hans Zimmer does have a producer credit, I think, in the credits for this film as well. I'm pretty sure I saw that last time I saw the movie. But we have a great little chase of the Black Pearl chasing the interceptor. And then Elizabeth comes up on deck and says, what is it? And Anna Maria says, the Black Pearl, she's gaining on us. Elizabeth says, this is the fastest ship in the Caribbean. And then Anna Maria says, you can tell them that after they caught us. So, of course, the Interceptor, as mentioned earlier in the film, is apparently the fastest ship in the Caribbean, but there's no ship in the ocean that can outrun the Black Pearl. The Black Pearl is the fastest ship in the Caribbean, and that is a known fact in the Pirates universe. So Elizabeth drafts a plan here to escape the Black Pearl by, losing them off into the shoals ahead in the water. And Gibbs, we don't have to rope them long, just long enough. And then Gibbs tells the crew, anything we can afford to lose, see that it's lost. So they throw off all their supplies. They take all that extra weight off the ship so the ship can move faster. So they can outrun the Black Pearl. And then Barbossa sees that they're doing this, and he tells the crew to run out the sweeps. So they pull out these oars from the gun ports, and they start, of course, rowing the ship, giving it extra speed. So, of course, in the olden days, back before sailing ships, with Vikings and things like that, they would, of course, have rows and oars on their ships to help, of course, sail the ship and make it go faster. So the Black Pearl employs this tactic here. This is the only time we see this used. We don't see the oars come back in any of the other films. This is the only time we see the oars kind of really pick up that speed and make the Black Pearl the fastest ship in the Caribbean. And then, of course, when the crew on the Interceptor sees this, they're like, it was a good plan until now. And then Will at this point comes back on deck and says, we must fight. And then he says, load the guns. But of course, they just got rid of all the cannonballs because they threw all their supplies overboard. And then Will says, we must fight with anything we have left. So they begin to load the guns with nails, crushed glass, utensils. They use anything they have left on the ship to load the guns. And then the Interceptor, of course, at this point, they are going to fight the Black Pearl. So they drop the anchor on the starboard side, and this dropping of the anchor spins the ship around, doing a pretty much like a 90-degree turn, and then right in front of the Black Pearl, forcing the Black Pearl to turn and broadside the ship. So Barbossa sees this and says, they're clop hauling, and that is the term for this technique that the Interceptor is employing is the clop haul. So the Black Pearl then broadsides with the Interceptor, and they get ready for the ship battle in this film. So every movie has a ship battle of some sort, besides the fourth movie, which does not have a ship battle. But the other movies all have some sort of a ship battle with two ships firing at each other. So this is the first one we get, which is between the Black Pearl and the Interceptor. So, of course, we have all of the main characters of the films saying fire, and then the two ships begin to duel it out on the open seas. So they're fighting, and then a cannonball comes into the brig where Jack is, of course, imprisoned, and blows the lock on the door part, so Jack is able to escape his cell. When this cannonball, though, does come into the cell, Jack has this great moment where he says, "Stop blowing holes in my ship," which I love. But then he escapes the brig, and then he comes out on deck and gets back onto the Interceptor. So he already has escaped the Black Pearl. And then Anna Maria, Gibbs, Will, and Elizabeth are pinned down on the Interceptor, of course, firing at the pirates on the Black Pearl. Of course, the pirates on the Pearl cannot die because they're cursed. So they are at a disadvantage here. So Anna Maria says, we need a Devil's Darren. Well, Gibbs says that. And then Anna Maria says, we'll give him her. And then Will says she's not what they're after. And then he realizes he left the medallion below deck. So Will goes down below deck to retrieve the medallion because that is what the pirates are after. And if they can, surrender the medallion, maybe they'll let them go. But in this moment, once Will goes below deck, Pintel and Rigetti grab a chain shot and they load it into their cannon and fire at the main mast on the Interceptor. So this chain shot, of course, is a real thing that pirates would use. It is two cannonballs linked together by a chain, hence the name chain shot. And this was used to take down masts or take down or do considerable damage to a ship. So it was mainly used to take down masts. Once masts were taken down, the ship would be disabled, which means they couldn't move. So they take down the mast on the Interceptor, and it blows out and locks Will below deck because the mast falls right over the hatch to get back on deck. So Will is trapped, and with the water filling, he can't find the medallion. So he's stuck down there and calling for help. And as the Interceptor's mast falls down, we have this great moment of Barbossa standing on deck, and then the mast just falls right down on the Black Pearl's deck, and there's a tear in the sail on the mast that's coming down, and it goes right over Barbossa. He just does not flinch, does not move at all, and I love that shot. It's so cool. And then he, of course, commands his pirates to board the Interceptor. And he says, "Pistols and cutlasses, men. Kohler and Twig to the powder magazine. And the rest of you, bring me that medallion." So now the pirates are engaging in sword fights with the pirates on the Interceptor. So it's in this moment here that Jack boards the Interceptor once more. And he saves Elizabeth from a pirate. And he's... right before the pirate is about to hit Elizabeth, he grabs his hand and he says, "That's not very nice." And Elizabeth then elbows the pirate and he goes overboard. And then Jack asks Elizabeth, "Where's the medallion?" And then he says, "Where is Will?" And then Elizabeth remembers Will went below deck. So she runs over to the hatch and sees him trying to get out, but he's stuck. So she, of course, tries to move the mast out of the way, but it's way too heavy. And she says, "I can't move it." And then, of course, the pirates then grab Elizabeth and they pull her away from the hatch while she is screaming Will's name. And then Will is left to die in the Interceptor. All the pirates are taken captive aboard the Black Pearl, and Will then sees Jack the Monkey, who has the medallion. So he tries to grab the medallion, but Jack the Monkey runs away, and Jack Sparrow sees Jack the Monkey going back onto the Black Pearl, so he follows the monkey, tries to grab the medallion, but he then realizes he's back aboard the Black Pearl, and Barbossa is standing right in front of him. So Barbossa then says, "Thank you, Jack." And then Jack Sparrow says, "You're welcome." And he says, "Not you, we named the monkey Jack." So of course this is now when we get the mention of the monkey being named Jack, but it is very confusing when we have Jack Sparrow and Jack the monkey in one scene because they're both named Jack and everything. But I do like how Barbossa did name the monkey after Jack. So I think it's a nice little kind of, because Jack, of course, was marooned, they still had a Jack on the ship. So Kohler and Twig, who are still currently below deck in another compartment of the Interceptor, they light the powder on fire, and they've stacked it up so the whole ship will explode once the fire hits the magazine. And then all the pirates from the Interceptor are now taken captive aboard the Black Pearl, and Pintel circles them and says, "If any of you so much as think the word parley, I'll have your guts for garters." And then Elizabeth frees herself and runs to Barbossa, but then the Interceptor explodes. So this leads me to that scale model of the Interceptor that we talked about in the last episode. So of course, I said that they made the scale model to do the storm scene because it would be way too dangerous to do that in open water. They also had to make that scale model because, of course, the Interceptor explodes, and they can't just blow up an actual ship. Because the Interceptor was the Lady Washington, which was a real ship, a real reproduction of a actual ship. And they, of course, didn't want to destroy that ship. So they used the scale model they used in the storm scene, and they rigged it to explode in this scene. So if you watch a behind-the-scenes video, they actually have a bit of this where they do explode it. And they only have one take to do it, so they had to, of course, get it right on the first try. But it's really cool to see them blow up the model because they have it in the same water tank as they did the storm scene. It was just all calm water. They have the ship sitting there, and then they hit the button, ship explodes, and it's so cool to see it all actually explode in like real life. So if you are interested in that, it is in the behind the scenes videos on YouTube. They're all over YouTube, but it's pretty easy to find. If not, I can link it on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, because I think it's really cool what they did with the scale model here. But the Interceptor is now destroyed. The fastest ship in the Caribbean, as everyone thought, is no longer the fastest ship in the Caribbean. And Elizabeth now thinks Will is dead because Will was still stuck in the Interceptor, and it has now exploded. So she gets really mad at Barbossa, and while she's having this tantrum with him, Will returns, and he steps up on deck, and he says, "Barbossa!" And they all turn, and they see Will, and then he jumps on deck, grabs a pistol, and says, "She goes free." And Barbossa says, "What's in your head, boy?" And Barbossa says, "You've only got one shot, and we can't die." And then Will says, "You can't, but I can." And then Jack says, "Try not to do anything stupid." And then Will then threatens his own life, and then Jack's like, "Oh, well." So I love Jack in that scene there. So Barbossa at this is confused, and he says, "Who are you?" And then Jack says, "No one. He's no one. A distant relative of my aunt twice removed. Lovely singing voice, though. Eunuch." And then Will says, "My name is Will Turner, son of Bootstrap Bill Turner. His blood runs in my veins." And then Rigetti says, "He's a spitting image of our Bootstrap Bill. Come back to haunt us." And then Will says, "My word, do as I say, or I'll pull this trigger and be lost to Davy Jones' locker." And then Barbossa says, "Name your terms, Mr. Turner." And he says, "Elizabeth goes free." And he's like, "Yes, we know that one. Anything else?" And then we had this cool little scene of Jack pointing to himself, like, "Pick me, pick me, pick me." And the crew were not to be harmed. And then Jack's still doing it, but Will just doesn't mention him. And then Barbossa says, "Agreed." So in the next scene here, the Black Pearl is pulling up to a deserted island. And Elizabeth is currently on the plank. So this is a pirate staple of walking the plank. So it is cool that we see it in this film. This first film has a lot of the kind of references and the stereotypes of pirates represented. which I think is pretty cool because we get to see, someone walking the plank. We get to see someone saying R, and all this cool stuff happens in this movie. Then Will says, "Barbossa, you lying bastard, you swore she'd go free." And then Barbossa says, "Don't dare impugn me honor, boy. I agreed she'd go free, but it was you who failed to specify when or where." So then Will is tied up and he is pulled away by the pirates. And then Barbossa forces Elizabeth to take the dress off before she jumps. And Elizabeth throws it back to him and says, "Goes to your black heart." So then Elizabeth is standing on the plank, ready to jump, but she's of course scared to. And this is also something that I'll bring up, a nice Keira Knightley fact about this film. Keira Knightley was terrified to actually jump off the plank. She did, in fact, jump off the plank. It was not a stunt woman or anything. It was Keira. But they were filming this scene for around 3 days, and she was standing on the plank for like 3 days. And then Gore Verbinski, the director of the film, came up to her and said, if you don't want to, you can just have your stunt woman do it. And then Keira's like, "I've been standing on this plank for 3 days. I'm going to jump off." So when they finally got to that scene, she did actually jump off the plank and go right into the water. And afterwards, she was very happy that she did it, even though she was, terrified to actually jump. She had all the adrenaline in the moment, and she did jump. So it is cool that Keira did actually jump off the plank in this scene. So the pirates are all laughing. Even Jack is laughing, but the pirates then bring him up to the plank, and he stops laughing immediately. And then he's like, "I really hoped we were past all this." And then Barbossa says to Jack, "Don't you notice? That be the same little island we made you governor of on our last little trip." And then Jack says, "I did notice." And then he says, "Perhaps you'll be able to conjure up another miraculous escape. But I doubt it. Off you go." And then Jack, before he jumps, he says, "Last time you left me a pistol with one shot." And then Barbossa returns Jack's pistol to him before he jumps. And then Jack says one more thing. He says, "Seeming as there's two of us, a gentleman will give us a pair of pistols." And then Barbossa says, "It'll be one pistol as before, and you can be the gentleman and shoot the lady and starve to death yourself." So he throws Jack's gear off the side, and Jack immediately jumps after it. Jack and Elizabeth have now been marooned, and this is on the same island Jack was marooned on last time, 10 years ago. So this is what is called Rum Runner's Isle. That's the name for this island in the Pirates universe. And it pops up a few times, in different media, so in books and games and stuff. It pops up, and we'll get to that later in this podcast. But of course, this is where Jack was marooned 10 years ago. And he says to Elizabeth, "That's the second time I've had to watch that man sail away with my ship." So they're marooned, and they don't know what to do because they don't have a ship. They don't have anything. They can't just swim to the Black Pearl. So I'll bring this up real quick before we get back into the plot. There are some really great deleted scenes for this island. And I'll bring them up here just because they are so good, and I would hate to not bring them up because they are seriously, I'm surprised they weren't in the movie. One of them, I am really shocked that it wasn't in the movie, because literally one of my personal favorite deleted scenes in the entire franchise. But when Jack is sitting there on the island, and he's depressed. He thinks it's over. Then Elizabeth, this is part of the deleted scene here. So Elizabeth says, "You were going to trade Will's life for a ship." And then Jack says, "We could use a ship, but the point was, I was not going to tell Barbossa about Bloody Will, because as long as he didn't know about Bloody Will, I still had something to bargain with, which now no one has, thanks to bloody stupid Will." So I love that scene, and then we go right back into what's actually in the movie, which is, Jack trying to find the Rum Runner's cache, which Elizabeth says, "But you were marooned on this island before, weren't you? So we can escape in the same way you did then." And Elizabeth then says, "But you're Captain Jack Sparrow." And she says all these great things about Jack, things that he's done, all the while Jack is trying to find this Rum Runner's cache. So he's taking a few paces, he's knocking on a tree, And then he jumps up and down and he finds it and he cracks it open and he sees the rum runner's cache, which of course is filled with rum. Elizabeth then says, "How did you escape last time?" And then Jack comes clean and says, "Last time, I was here a grand total of 3 days, all right? Last time, the rum runners used this island as a cache. They came by and I was able to barter a passage off. But by the looks of things, they've long been out of service. Probably have your bloody friend Norrington to thank for that." And then Elizabeth says, "So that's it then. That's the grand adventure of Captain Jack Sparrow. You spent 3 days lying on a beach, drinking rum." And then Jack says, "Welcome to the Caribbean, love." And then we go right to a deleted scene, which is the one I was referring to, which is the really great one. And Elizabeth asks Jack, "Is there any truth to the other stories?" And then Jack says, "Truth?" And then he pulls up his sleeve on his right arm and shows her his pirate brand. And then he goes over to his left arm and pulls up his sleeve and shows her the long scar on his arm. And then he pulls down the collar of his shirt to show his 2 gunshot wounds. And then when Elizabeth sees all these, she steps back. And the music in this scene is so eerie and it's fantastic. And he shows her all these wounds. And then he says, "No truth at all." I am so surprised they didn't put that in the film. I think it adds so much to Jack Sparrow's character. And I wish it was in the film. I can't believe it's not. Because I love that scene so much. It gives so much more character and backstory to Jack and all this mystery. The whole point of Jack Sparrow is this mystery surrounding his character. We don't know his past. We don't know where he came from. So seeing all these wounds, seeing where he's been and these things that he's done and gone through, I love that moment. It adds to the mythos of Jack Sparrow so much, and I'm so sad it wasn't in the film. If you do want to see this though, just look it up on YouTube. There's a compilation of all the deleted scenes for Curse of the Black Pearl, even Dead Man's Chest, At World's End. There's tons of deleted scenes for these first 3 movies. And a lot of them I'll bring up on these episodes when we get to them in the plot, just because I really wish that they would have been actually in the film. So, of course, they found the rum runner's cache and they grab the rum out. And then we go right over to the next scene, which is Jack and Elizabeth dancing around a fire, and they are singing "Yo Ho, Yo Ho, A Pirate's Life for Me," which we are bringing it back. This is how we opened up the film. This is, of course, the song from the theme park ride. So they are singing it here, dancing around the fire, having a great time. And then Jack almost passes out. He falls right down on the sand, and Elizabeth joins him, and he has this great moment where he's like, "And I'm going to teach it to the whole crew, and we'll sing it all the time." And then Elizabeth says, "And you'll become the most feared pirate in the Spanish Main." And then Jack says, "Not just the Spanish Main, love. The entire ocean. The entire world. Wherever we want to go. That's what a ship is, It's not just a keel and a hull and a deck and a sails. That's what a ship needs. But what a ship is, what the Black Pearl really is freedom." And that leads us into what the main theme of this film and this franchise is, and it's freedom. Jack wants the Black Pearl back because that's his freedom. When he has the ship, he can go wherever he wants. He can do whatever he wants. And that's what the Black Pearl means to him. It means freedom. When he's on that ship, he's free. He doesn't have to take orders from anyone else. He's free. And this is something that Barbossa doesn't understand, and that's why there's this great dynamic and this great opposition between the two of them, is Barbossa doesn't understand that. And Barbossa has been cursed for 10 years now, and he can't be free. He is cursed. He can't feel anything. He can't feel a good drink. He can't feel a good meal in his stomach. He can't feel anything, and now he can't be free because of this curse. So that's the great dynamic and the opposition between Jack and Barbossa. Both of the characters are so alike, but they are so different at the same time. because Jack understands this meaning of being free, but Barbossa does not. And of course, when we finally see Barbossa being free later in this film, it's the only time he gets to feel free before something happens to him. But this is one of my favorite scenes in this entire franchise. I love this speech by Jack because it really brings out that main theme of freedom for these films, because that's what the Black Pearl means to him. It means freedom. It's not just a ship to him. It is his ship, but it's not just a ship. It means freedom to him. So Jack then drinks a bunch more, and Elizabeth, of course, wanted this to happen, so Jack passes out drunk. And he wakes up the next morning and smells smoke. And then he looks around and sees Elizabeth is burning all of the rum to make a smoke signal. And of course, not just the rum, but also the trees are also on fire too. But Jack then sees her destroying all the rum and he says, "No, not good. What are you doing? You burned all the food, the shade, the rum." And Elizabeth says, "Yes, the rum is gone." And then we have the famous line that has now become a meme. "Why is the rum gone?" And then if you grew up in the early 2000s, you have there's another thing for this line, and that is the "Why is the rum gone" song on YouTube. I have listened to that song so many times in my life, and I know if you grew up with Pirates of the Caribbean, you know what song I'm talking about. Now when I'm mentioning it, I hope it gets stuck in your head again, or you just listen to it. If you haven't listened to it, go search up "Why is the rum gone" song on YouTube, and it's fantastic. It's a great relic of the early 2000s, and oh my god. I love that line. I love that video. Then, after he says this, of course, Elizabeth then says, 1, because it is a vile drink that turns even the most respectable men into complete scoundrels. 2, that smoke signal is over 1,000 feet high. The entire Royal Navy is out looking for me. Do you really believe there's the slightest chance they don't see it? And then Jack says, "Well, why is the rum gone?" And then Elizabeth says one more thing. She says, "Just you wait, Captain Sparrow. Give it an hour, maybe 2, keep a weather eye open, you'll see white sails on that horizon." And then Jack, who is super angry here, pulls out his pistol and wants to shoot Elizabeth, but he decides against it because that's not what his shot is for. He's still saving that shot, and he knows now is not the opportune moment. So then Jack then goes off and circles the island, and he's really mad at Elizabeth, and then he sees a ship approaching. And the ship is the Dauntless, which is carrying Commodore Norrington and Elizabeth's father, Governor Swan. So Jack and Elizabeth are rescued off of Rum Runner's Island, and Governor Swan wants to go back to Port Royal immediately. But Elizabeth says, we have to save Will. And then Governor Swan says, "No, you're safe. We'll depart for Port Royal immediately." And then Elizabeth says, "Then we condemn him to death." And then Governor Swan says, "The boy's fate is regrettable, but so is his decision to engage in piracy." And then Elizabeth says, he only did it to rescue me. And then Jack butts in during the conversation and says, the Black Pearl was listing heavily after the battle. It'd be highly improbable that she would make good time. And then, he goes up to Norrington and tries to, get Norrington to do what he says. Just think, the Black Pearl, the last real threat in the Caribbean, mate. How can you pass that up? And then Norrington says, "By remembering I serve others, Mr. Sparrow, not only myself." And then Elizabeth, of course, because she wants to save Will, she does the only thing she can, which is accepting Commodore Norrington's proposal. And she says, "Please do this as a wedding gift." And then Governor Swan is, completely surprised and happy. "You're accepting the Commodore's proposal?" And she says, "I am." And then Jack says, "Weddings, I love weddings, drinks all around." And then Norrington goes up to Jack and, tells him, "You'll accompany these men to the helm and give us a bearing to Isla de Muerta. You'll then spend the rest of the voyage contemplating the term, silent as the grave. Do I make myself clear?" Jack is then brought up to the helm to give them their course to Isla de Muerta. And then we have a deleted scene here, which is also a very important one that really, I think, gives more into Norrington's character, which is also one that I'm sad they cut out of the film, which is Norrington takes Elizabeth to the side of the ship, and, he says, "I'm concerned that your acceptance was not sincere," because Norrington is, under the impression that she's only doing it to save Will. That's why she accepted, because she wants Norrington to help. And I love this scene because it really brings some great emotion to James Norrington, and I'm sad they cut it out. So Elizabeth then, reinforces that she does mean to marry him, and it's not just to save Will, it's to really marry him. And she's making this sacrifice here because she wants to save Will's life, and the only way to save Will, of course, is to get married to Norrington. So she's doing this to save Will, so he doesn't end up dying. And she leaves in this scene, and Governor Swan comes up, and, it says, "Why are we really doing this?" And then Norrington tells him, Will Turner is a man under the crown, which means he's under my supervision and my protection. And with that, they chart a course for Isla de Muerta to save Will and take down Barbossa and his pirate crew. And we'll get to the conclusion of this film in the very next episode. I know it's going to take me 4 episodes to get through one film. That's crazy. But the whole point of this is to really delve into these films and not skip over things. I really want to really detail these films, bring the nuances up, so people who've seen the films who didn't notice them will now realize, oh, that's what they were referring to, or that's what they were talking about, or things like that. And that's why these are so in-depth, so I can really get a chunk of the movie and really explain everything that's happening in it. So in the next episode, we will conclude The Curse of the Black Pearl when we return to Isla de Muerta. So I love how we ended episode 2 before we got to Isla de Muerta, and now we're ending episode 3 before we get back to Isla de Muerta. So next week, we'll be finishing Curse of the Black Pearl, and then the week after, we'll probably be starting Dead Man's Chest, which is the second film. But I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you're enjoying this podcast so far. I'm really only doing this because I love these films. I have always loved this franchise, and I really wanted something to express my love and help other people understand why these films and this franchise is so fantastic. And I really wanted something to really express that, and I thought a podcast would probably be the best idea. So even if no one's listening to this, or if you're enjoying this, I thank you for listening, because this is mainly me just talking into the void for Pirates of the Caribbean, because I could talk endlessly about these films and this franchise in general. But I hope you're enjoying if you've been listening. And if you have been listening and you have enjoyed it, please consider giving a review on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts if you're listening over there. Please give us a rating and review. That'll greatly help the podcast be pushed up in the ratings, and it'll help new listeners find the podcast, especially if they love Pirates of the Caribbean or they're interested in learning more about it. So I thank you for listening. I hope you'll join us next week as we conclude the first film in our franchise here. We're not just doing the films on this podcast. No, we have books, we have theme park rides to do, we have so much stuff to cover because there's been so much Pirates of the Caribbean over the past 20 years. Because next year, 2023, is the 20th anniversary of The Curse of the Black Pearl. So we're going to be going all out, and we're going to really be celebrating in a great way to celebrate 20 years of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise and all these fantastic characters that we've all come to love so much. So stay tuned for all those fantastic things coming. I thank you for listening. Join us next week as we finish Curse of the Black Pearl. I'll see you then. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Twitter at podcastpotc, or you can also follow us over on Instagram at Podcast of the Caribbean. I'll be posting some content, some other fun facts that I don't cover on the podcast, so if you want to learn even more about Pirates of the Caribbean, make sure to go over to those platforms and give us a follow. Be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.